So I think for this session we're going through the resolution of the conference which has been developed since the first day of the conference. So it should have taken in everything that most people have spoken about, and some people have had a chance to already input additional ideas. But we're going to just read through it, get a general consensus that everyone agrees that this says what it should say, and if anyone has anything extra to add, just in the room, put your hand up, and I don't know if we have online participants.
Yeah, so they online and they can also write in the chat or turn on microphone.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go through it slowly, and anyone who has any additional comments, just feel free to let us know as we go. So these are policy recommendations to promote biodiversity-based agriculture. Agricultural systems cover approximately 40% of the land surface of the earth and thus have a significant biospheric impact. This impact will only increase as the population grows by an additional 2 billion by 2050 and requires 30% more food production globally than is produced at present. Ideally, these challenges would be met through the sustainable intensification of agriculture. Notwithstanding the gains of contemporary industrial agriculture, there have also been numerous drawbacks due to dependence on intensive management and on the availability of scarce and non-renewable resources, and consequently their negative impact on ecosystems. Agriculture sector is one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters, from 10 to 35% of total greenhouse gas emissions in Europe and about 9% in the USA. Modern industrial agriculture results in the simplification of the structure of the environment, replacing diversity with a small number of varieties for its major crops, with declining species richness and decreasing trait and functional diversity in general, thus increasing the vulnerability associated with genetic uniformity. In this sense, it is high risk. Progress towards a more low-risk agriculture is required that would be compatible with ecosystem preservation, halting the loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems, and resistance to climate change. This is emphasised in Europe's Common Agricultural Policy, in Biodiversity Action Plan for Agriculture, and in the United Nations Report on Agroecology and the Right to Food. Diversified agricultural practices can provide numerous ecosystem services. The benefits human populations derive directly or indirectly from ecosystem functions, such as increased biodiversity, improved control of pests, diseases and weeds, better and more stable soil health, reduced soil erosion, improved water and nutrient management, and increased resilience of the agro-ecosystem. No-till perennial agriculture systems can serve as an efficient CO2 sinks capable of conserving up to 0.5 to 1.5 tonnes of carbon annually on a global scale. In addition, polyculture systems, simultaneous cultivation of several crops in the same space, produce on average 38% more gross energy and 33% more gross incomes, whilst using 23% less land. Implementation of agrobiodiversity protection measures capable to increase food and biofuel production to meet the needs of increasing human population with the fossil fuel decline and in line with nature protection and restoration under increased anthropogenic pressure, and the need to mitigate and adapt to climate change requires intersectoral, government, academics, farmers, NGOs and international cooperation. We define the following key points summarising recent findings and successful approaches to guide decision makers. Number 1, developing regional land use approach, mosaic landscape, compatible with nature conservation and provisioning of ecosystem services. A, grounded in ecosystem approach, based on enhancing structural and successional landscape heterogeneity and connectivity. It should consider appropriate biodiversity protection measures for different land use categories. Natural reserves and natural parks must be buffered by extensively used agricultural lands, employing measures to meet special requirements of naturally occurring, in particular endangered species, including scientifically defined minimum size of habitat. minimum proportion of natural and semi-natural habitats apart from subsidiary crops is required for biodiversity conservation and provisioning of ecosystem services. It is defined as 5% in research literature, as well as in EU Common Agricultural Policy as the size of ecological focus areas. There's a bracket there that maybe shouldn't. Okay. Must be assured by identifying and protecting biodiversity hotspots and converting degraded and low productivity agricultural lands into semi-natural habitats. It should account for intensity of agriculture production, in particular the percentage of aggregated monoculture lands. Example, enhanced need for pollination and biocontrol services, preventing leakage of agricultural chemicals, inadequate provisioning of forage and habitat for wildlife. Increasing landscape connectivity by protecting and establishing of biocorridors, multifunctional windbreaks and hedgerows, set aside land, road purges, riparian buffer zones, recommended width range from 3 metres nutrient filter to 24 metres, preserving high floral diversity, and up to 144 metres, preserving bird diversity, and small heterogeneous stepping stone habitats for parasitoids and other small useful insects and spiders which profit from locally good conditions, including solitary trees, tree shrubs and grassland patches with area of tens of square metres scattered among the fields. Since biocorridors must occupy a significant proportion of agriculture lands, then management must be compatible with extensive perennial agricultural production, diversified and bioenergy forestry, extensive organic horticulture, forest farming and silvopasture systems. Ensuring equal distribution of natural and semi-natural habitats rather than their net area.
So I think that maybe just not to take it all in one thing, that maybe we can discuss about this. Like this 5% and the fact that it should be apart from subsidiary crop like cover crops, catch crops. I took from the previous Common Agriculture Policy, and maybe someone knows it better, that I think that in present agriculture policies, so this area is just out of agriculture production. So at least that might be like the current situation in Europe, and I don't know like what is the situation, for example, in the USA.
Probably more, but you won't get it.
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the region, just differences in climatic and kind of natural areas. I think it's quite variable.
Yes, and then like this fact about biocorridors, so basically what we already discussed about this hedge growth, that they should serve for production, not only for conservation, but also for production purpose, and it might be some disagreements between the like agriculture and forestry legislation and protection and production activities. So like I highlighted this, so probably that should be also solved.
Can you scroll up just for a minute? Yeah. So make sure you've got pen further. Sorry. So this is point 1. A, I, and there's all these are part of I. Is that right?
Yeah. So basically, like this is all I consider like specific land use depending on let's say its category. So is it close to a natural park, or it should be a part of biocorridor, so it should be like the stepping stone habitat. So I kind of look at it it's just about the recommended total area of such habitats.
So to ensure equal distribution of natural and semi-natural habitats rather than their net area. We consider local socioeconomic limitations, availability of workforce for adoption of labour-intensive cropping systems, and problems, pollution and erosion. Provide fiscal support for growers to implement, as well as research funding to develop and promote polyculture strategies. Intercropping and recommended rotation schemes are often less profitable and more management intensive in a short-term perspective compared to continuous cultivation of valuable cash crops. Efficiency of polyculture schemes in sustaining agroecosystem services and local biodiversity depend, and in this agroecosystem measures should be evaluated based on functional crop diversity. For example, an increase from 1 to 3 dominating crop types equated to an average 33% rise in biological control of aphids. Creation of heterogeneous and permanent habitats and continuity in forage resource provisioning for the wildlife organisms. Preferred support for integrated diversified farming practices, permaculture, organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, carbon farming, conservation agriculture, holistic farming, forest farming. If anyone has anything to add to that list, which may or may not be necessary, you can. And approaches, rotational grazing, diversified forestry, rather than for particular operations. Acknowledging perennial tree-based agricultural systems, resolving legal and administrative separation between agriculture and forestry, and between conservation practices and commercial production practices.
Just put that in this thing.
So basically, that's also what I try to tell now. Yeah.
Meticulous research of public and social costs, informing general public and efforts in achieving social transformation, considering the value, protection and enhancing ecological services as common non-market goods must proceed to any cardinal regulatory change in land use and support schemes for farmers and landowners.
Yeah, so basically, this is particularly relevant for Ukrainian situation, where we have the land market opening and related agriculture, change in agriculture policies. So I would like to highlight that without this research and education, we just cannot do these cardinal changes.
Appropriate systems of scientific indicators, biodiversity indexes and decision-making models must be used to define land use approaches and payments for ecosystem services, as well as efficiency and agroecosystem measures. Both models and indicators must be defined as a consent or compromise between different groups of stakeholders, social scientists, economists, agronomists, ecologists, farmers. Link different aspects of ecological, economic and social dimensions, integrate micro, farm and macro regional models. Be relevant to farm type, scale and landscape. Indicators have to meet the following criteria. Be measurable at low cost. Be relatively simple and user-friendly whenever possible for monitoring by trained farmers. Flower colour index, butterfly abundance, landscape structuring degree, patch diversity index. Examples. Models have to meet following criteria. Be relevant for the farm type. Focus on cascades of processes and functions rather than specific indicators to define areas of complementarity and efficient points of intervention. Be harmonised yet appropriate for local institutional environment. Be regularly revised to investigate effective errors in complex models. Subsidies, payments for ecosystem services should discourage destruction of natural systems. Conversion of permanent species grasslands into species poor swards, conversion of heathlands and peatlands into arable lands. Favour long-term support schemes, particularly targeted at establishment of perennial vegetation. Be result versus action-oriented, be restricted to the appropriate spatial scale, encourage cooperation between farmers towards land stewardship. Compensate for possible risks of crop failure in complex experimental systems. Resource sparing to developing countries via implementation of bioregional agrobiodiversity strategies, enabling development of shared models, classifications and indicators, focused international funding schemes, examples, and then, in corrupted societies with poor institutional capacity, such funding should be preferably managed by donor countries or international organisations in collaboration with local NGOs. Ecological tax for unsustainable agriculture producers and carbon subsidies should be considered by developing countries as possible funding sources for agroecological measures, as well as selling or leasing land at reduced cost or free provisioning for restoration agriculture projects. Reduced rates for governmental loans, government procurement of agricultural produce, latter measures should serve as prerequisites for the international funding to developing countries.
Yeah, so like here I try to achieve both targets. So like first that we need to share resources to some extent, like these models, for example, so they should be developed for the bioregional scale. But from the other hand, we should encourage governments to act even for like poor developing countries as Ukraine, because like it's easy to say about subsidies for developed country, but still in developing we have a lot of resources and we need to push on politicians to use these resources.
The next section is education and agriculture extension services are not sufficient in developed countries and almost lacking in developing countries for sufficient implementation of biodiversity protection schemes in agriculture. It should be based on extensive networking between farmers, other producers, the academia and NGOs. Okay, so that's what's been developed as a result of the conference. If there aren't any additional comments, then you all agree that that kind of reflects. I don't know if you've been listening into the other 2 days of the conference or not. No, well, I haven't either actually. So, but this has been written up by Sonia and Pablo, and then I've had some online input. Yeah, mainly Pablo, and then had some online input to develop it. So it's just kind of saying everyone in the room and everyone online kind of agrees that this reflects what the conference sort of discussed into policy recommendations in some way. There might be, maybe if we leave it available online, if you actually have interest to read it again and you think of anything extra to add, maybe you could leave it open for a couple of days and then you could do that so that it's not such an information overload. You can just do it on the weekend or something when there's some time, or early next week. So that's another option as well, so that you don't have to do it all right now. Yeah, so I think that unless there was anything there that you sort of thought, oh, maybe it could say this as well, or.
Do you have any way of putting in teeth, as they say in this country, you know, so that a good idea actually gets enforced?
Mm.
Could there be what group would decide how to make sure it is enforced, you know, this does happen?
Or is actually included in policy.
Okay.
In that way, it's actually even included in the written into policy and then implemented.
So like basically, of course, this is the first step. This is not kind of recommendation which we can, some policymakers can apply it straightforward, but at least it might be a first stage. So basically, just to explain how we are going to proceed with this. Within this Visegrad ground, which helped us to organize this conference, it was included to give policy recommendation on biodiversity-based agriculture for 4 Central European countries and for Ukraine. And we decided that it should start from the conference resolution to give it some weight, and then we are also composing article in the International Peer-Reviewed Research Journal, and we will develop this recommendation. So we will also, basically the idea is, like, I try to combine both like this research language, some documented evidence with clear picture. So the clear picture, we will have some like illustration of possible diversification pathways like forest farming, like agroforestry and so on, like of course, at least I know about American politicians, but Ukrainian politicians, they don't know anything about that. And it's just not in their agenda, just to bring somehow their interest that this is important, and like also bring some interest towards farmers, because now when this land market will be open, of course, if they don't know about the benefit and if they are not encouraged by the state to develop this eco-intensive agriculture, they just sell it and lose it forever. And that's it.
You have to educate the farmers and the politicians at the same time to make it happen.
That's what we are trying to do. Yeah.
Doesn't it take like mothers or something involved too? You need masses. If it's not coming from the top, you're going to have some kind of grassroots support.
We are trying to do this with our NGO, yes, and we try to collaborate with some other folks in this area.
Have you heard of Moms Across America? They've done a lot of work getting glyphosate out of cities, out of towns. They have, they use media, and she's been on TV, and so have other people in the group. They've gotten a lot done because it is a grassroots aimed at moms who care about their kids.
So maybe, I guess that's included in education and agricultural extension services as NGOs. You could put examples, looking at like social leaders, like NGOs that use, social leaders in some way to educate others or something like that.
Well, the facts about pesticide toxicity for children are pretty shocking.
Yeah.
And when parents know them,
they care
They shape
more
up.
like an
Yeah.
So
mothers again.
others.
Mothers
Across America.
across America, yeah. They weren't marching, but they were there.
And we have a comment from online participants, so maybe Jorge, you can again join this microphone, if it's convenient for you.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay, this is a recurrent question that I have posted. I think that to honor the aim to give policy recommendations to support a biodiversity-based agriculture, it needs to include a recommendation to also integrate and not fence out or exterminate wild carnivore mammals. And like when talking about animal integration for pest, weed and fertility management, for seasonal grazing, or for silvopasture, this is very important because otherwise you are not talking about biodiversity in the world, just biodiversity that serves a specific purpose for human benefits in agriculture.
Probably go to mosaic landscape point, and then
mosaic landscape.
there's a point about mosaic landscape, and within that we can mention non-agricultural landscape patches, or because we somewhat discussed that point yesterday really briefly about whether we're talking about, well, I've been told in America it's more like working land, or I call it active agricultural landscape patches versus natural or semi-natural state landscape patches. So when we consider those two areas, then your point's more about configuration and composition of the landscape in a way, and then also about how to use non-agricultural landscape patches, I think, unless if something along those lines.
Yes, so I just make a comment. I think that without necessary explanation, if we include this, we will frighten the politicians and farmers.
In Yellowstone, they don't like the wolves. So that, even though it was very good for the environment, the local farmers don't like them.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a discussion about like what is a pest species, and there's a lot of allowances in the U.S. to, and many other places, that there's lots of animals that are pests and vermin, and regardless of their, naturalness in the landscape, whether or not they're native species, they can be exterminated for any reason. So I feel like there's a discussion to be had about
what is a pest or something.
yeah, like policy and approaches towards, kind of adjacent ecosystems and species.
So improved understanding of the role of adjacent.
Yeah, because I think, as you create this mosaic, you also create opportunity for more interaction.
Yeah.
When you have a corridor, a biocorridor, a mountain lion can cross it just as much as a rabbit. So I think that there's policies that become problematic around, what animals are allowed to be in our mosaic.
Yeah, okay.
So
It's improved
We're
understanding.
encouraged to be.
Yeah, we're encouraged.
Yeah,
And I think it's relevant in Europe too, is there's reintroductions of species, wild boar in many places.
in most cases, that type of rewilding happens
Yeah.
away from where any human is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's really well planned, so it's in a restricted area, so they won't just wander off into. So, yeah, but in terms of like biological corridors and things like that, it's a good point to maybe include. Sometimes with policy recommendations, they decide not to, so that they don't have to think, because as soon as they think about it, they think, and then they don't know what to do.
There's a lot of advocacy. The person who's affected by the pest or the vermin has a lot of input. I know here, for example, ranchers have a lot of political power because they don't want mountain lions, even if they're not particularly problematic in certain areas, and so they have a lot of lobbying. So I think that's where, bringing in farmers into the development of mosaic landscapes and that component is valuable, because otherwise it becomes adversarial because you're inviting pests.
But you have to also, if you're developing school curriculum for the children of those ranchers, then the kids can educate their parents, and that is a slow but sure method.
Or when they take over the ranch.
So,
well, maybe not the role of adjacent ecosystem species in agricultural mosaic landscapes or in agricultural landscapes. Because it's easy to kind of divert from the original purpose is polyculture, so we're talking about agricultural landscapes, and in most cases, predators like that are mainly going to be present due to neighbouring ecosystems or biocorridors, but not because of maybe because if the agricultural landscape's in a protected area or systems within a protected area, then that's a different case as well.
Yeah, maybe it's worth talking about it in the biocorridor protected area section.
As well, yeah.
Actually, we had a comment, it's not included here yet, but we had a comment from Ukrainian, during the Ukrainian session discussions that actually, like here, we don't have this in the USA, but in Ukraine we have kind of these windbreaks, like 1, 3, 5 rows of tall trees along to each roads. And we would like to emphasize that this should be considered as a part of biocorridors, and they should be treated as biocorridors. So there is a comment from Jorge that it should be, for example, fenced to protect biodiversity and also to protect us from biodiversity.
So use of windbreaks as biocorridors, but also as as a fence or some sort of
so like
barrier.
fences, and it should be kind of just tunnels behind the roads. In Europe, they have all of this.
So maybe that could go in the biocorridor. There's a point about biocorridors, and then that could increasing that sort of connectivity by protecting, establishing biocorridors, recognizing. So, that's multifunctional windbreaks. Maybe within multifunctional, it's about so using windbreaks as biocorridors and also as sort of diverting wildlife or predators.
It was mentioned before, a living fence. So you can almost consider it maybe a living fence.
Yeah,
Try and use it as a
something
barrier.
like that, as a barrier, right? Because it's a windbreak, but also something like a wildlife barrier, something like that.
Sometimes the term shelter belt is also used for a somewhat wider than a windbreak, but narrower than a forest. So it's more of a, buffer.
Yeah, but it would also be composed of something that the predators aren't interested in, so that they wouldn't be cross over into the agricultural land.
No big fat cows.
Yeah. Exactly.
So basically, there are a lot of points about protecting biodiversity. So, and of course, there are a lot of economic and social points. So, here, I would like to concentrate on the topic on the conference, which are polyculture, diversification within the agricultural land, but we already, like in Ukraine, we already have some connections with other policy recommendations. So, for example, on some economics aspects of sustainable farming, so maybe we could like design a package to submit it as one package. So something like this.
Well, do you bring up the hazards of toxins used in conventional agriculture? I mean, that's a good selling point to the voters.
And
But you have to have the voters overcome the oligarchs. Every country has them, you know.
so is there a section about reduced use of pesticides or chemicals or external synthetic inputs?
Wasn't there a part about pest control?
Biocontrol. So that I think that
So it's kind of just a part of all of
so it's sort of emphasising the benefits of polycultures associated with reduced use of pesticides.
And also IPM, less cost. I mean, farmers don't like to pay for those poisons if they don't have to.
So emphasising benefit of polycultures and IPM.
so
Reduced need for.
And I feel like the economics part is getting overlooked on the money saving if you do it this way by, you know, the organic soils hold water better. You're not using pesticides. You're not bringing in soils. You're creating the full circle, which is taking, because I see in here we're talking about the risk of trying new things, right? Being costly. We're needing subsidies to take care of the cost of doing this. But in the long run, the idea is to save money and make the farm sustainable, right? So sustainability is another way of saying saving money, right?
Yeah.
So, and everything's about money. All we've talked, everything kind of come back to the cost, the value of the crop.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking away from the value of the crop if you put a hedgerow in, but so if you make that hedgerow profitable as well, but also that hedgerow has a benefit that's not necessarily monetary or profitable, but it takes away from the overhead cost of the other parts of the farm.
That hedgerow could be profitable because if it's, for instance, bringing in pollinators that are 2 to 3 times more efficient than honeybees, and you dedicate in the Midwest, even if you dedicate 10% you take away 10% of the land, you devote it to native plants. You bring in the pollinators, on what you have left, 90%, you actually have a 20%
increase
in yield of your existing crops. So that is profit right there.
Right. So painting that picture for politicians, farmers, everybody to know that there's.
What about emphasising the economic sustainability and benefit of polycultures? Examples include something like that for this document.
Right.
So actually like having
so I actually I highlighted here that I include some examples on the productivity, then somewhere it was like this 36% about aphid controls. So like of course we can give more examples just to try to keep it low. I also have examples on the rate of nutrient provisioning just nature, which is quite high. So I think that like the important aspect is like of course we cannot. It will be like a little bit lie if we just give these numbers, because like of course these are particular situations which have been studied, and but I think that it's important to emphasize that we need to do more research for that, because there are some good practices, but because it's like compared to conventional agriculture, it's much less money invested in biodiversity. If we had different situation, maybe it would be already the same profitable. But
could we add like as a point underneath key points, could one of the key points be emphasise and learn more about the economic sustainability and benefit of polycultures compared to conventional?
I mean, you can underscore that this is a sector that has potentially huge growth. I mean, you have monocultural systems that potentially have space for additional, profits. We have the right research and tools.
Exactly.
So, there's a potential for a whole new growth of economic development in this. We just don't have everything we need.
And if the recommendation could include that the government somehow subsidizes initial steps for the farmer so that they don't feel that everything is at risk, that they're covered, like crop insurance, for if it doesn't work, because it does take time. It takes years.
it's like both ends. So like this first funding is important, but what Sonia already told that it's also continuous funding, which is also important. So it's kind of both. So we are
angle there about, like rural economic development opportunity, which always sounds attractive, I think, to policymakers. As long as that's in there somewhere.
We just need to close.